Okay, when I say the word flag, what pops into your head? It's probably a piece of cloth, right? Waving in the wind, symbolizing a country. But what if I told you that way before the first cloth flag ever existed, ancient civilizations had these incredibly powerful symbols they carried straight into battle? And these things, they looked nothing like what we think of as a flag. So let's do this. We're going to jump back thousands of years to ancient Mesopotamia and find out where the very first battle standards came from.
First things first, we got to get our terms straight. Over on the left, that's a flag. We all know what that is, a piece of fabric. But on the right, that's what came before it. It's called a vexilloid. Now that's a much bigger category for any flag-like object, and usually it was a pole with some kind of three-dimensional symbol on top, maybe a carved animal or a sign of a god. For a huge chunk of ancient history, these vexilloids were the real deal, the true symbols of power.
And that brings us right to the heart of it. If the first standards weren't cloth flags, then what were they? What were they even for? The answer is this really cool story of evolution, from just being sacred markers to becoming these essential tools of imperial war.
So yeah, the official term here is vexilloid. A vexillologist named Whitney Smith actually came up with it back in 1958, and it's the perfect word for these early symbols. They did the job of a flag, they were rallying points, they showed who was who, but they were basically sculptures on sticks. Think of the Roman eagle, right? Or an Egyptian god being carried high above the crowd. Those were vexilloids.
Now, here's something that might surprise you. The very first standards we see in Mesopotamia, they had absolutely nothing to do with fighting. Their whole purpose was tied up in religion and, well, architecture. They were basically signs for holy places.
To really get this story, we need a quick roadmap. We're kicking things off in the late Uruk period, around 3300 BCE, with these so-called architectural standards. Then, we're going to jump into the early dynastic period, where we start to see standards in war scenes, but not in the way you'd expect. And then, finally, we get to the Akkadian period. That's the moment it all changes, and the true battle standard is born.
This is a perfect illustration of what I mean. On the left, you've got a picture of an early standard, the ring post. And then, on the right, you see the symbol for it in the world's very first writing system, cuneiform. So you see, these weren't just objects, they were ideas, woven right into the fabric of their language, representing big divine concepts.
And this is the key takeaway for this early period. The first Mesopotamian standards were really just signs that said, hey, this place is sacred. They'd mark temples, shrines, even the pens that held a god's special animals. They were physical signs of a divine presence, of holy ground, totally separate from the whole idea of organizing an army.
Okay, let's move on to the next phase, because this is where it gets a little tricky, and it's where a lot of people get the story wrong. We start seeing standards showing up in war scenes. But as we're about to find out, just because the standard is near a battle doesn't make it a battle standard. All right, take a look at this. This is the famous Standard of and it's honestly one of the most incredible things ever pulled out of the ground. We're talking around 2500 BCE here. Now, the name Standard of that's something we came up with. We don't actually know for sure what it was used for. But that war panel on the side, it's got everything. Soldiers, chariots, prisoners, and you can totally see these pole-like things that look a lot like standards. So, case closed, right? This is a battle standard. Well, not so fast.
This quote from the research just hits the nail on the head. The secret is all about timing. If you look really close at the scene on the Standard of or on another famous piece called the Stele of the Vultures, the action isn't what you think. It's not the chaos and clash of armies.
And that right there is the crucial difference. These incredible artifacts, they're showing what happens after the fighting is over. The prisoners are being rounded up, the victory parade is starting, and that's when the standards are brought out to show that the gods approved of the victory. They're not being used to rally troops or give commands in the middle of the fight, and that's a huge distinction. So if those weren't real battle standards, what was? Well, for that we need to fast forward a couple hundred years to the Akkadian Empire and a king named Naram Sin. This is where the game completely changes.
And here it is, the victory stele of Naram Sin. It was made to celebrate his win over the Lullaby people. I mean, just look at it. It's a masterpiece of ancient art, but it's also a revolutionary piece of history, because carved right into this stone is the very first evidence we have of a true battle standard being used in Mesopotamian warfare.
Let's zoom in a little closer. See that? Following the king up the mountain are his soldiers, marching in these perfect disciplined lines. And who's leading them? Two guys carrying vexilloids. Now look at the enemy.
They're scattered, they're falling, they're begging for their lives. This is not a victory parade, people. This is the moment of victory itself. The battle is still happening. So, why was this such a revolution, a total game changer? Well, first off, like we just saw, the standards are right there in the middle of the battle, not showing up for the party afterward. Second, look at the army they're leading. It's methodical, it's organized, it's disciplined, a huge contrast to the enemy, who are all over the place. That tells you these standards were probably used for command and control. Third, this brings the idea of divine protection into the fight itself. And finally, this whole scene reflects a massive political shift. We're not just talking about a single city-state anymore, this is the army of an empire.
So here it is, the whole evolution, side by side. The earlier Sumerian standards, they were symbols of a victory that was already won. But the Akkadian battle standards of Naram Sin, they were tools to get that victory, used to organize and lead troops right there in the heat of combat. It's a completely fundamental shift in what the symbol was for.
And this transformation wasn't just some military upgrade. It tells us something really deep about how power and society were changing in the ancient world.
So, in just about 1,000 years, we watched the Mesopotamian standard go from being a static sign for God's house to a dynamic tool of empire. It became a symbol not just of a divine presence, but of divine support for military conquest and the expansion of an empire.
And that kind of leaves us with one last thing to think about. The technology's changed for sure, from a carved emblem on a pole to a printed piece of cloth. But the basic idea, it's still the same. It really makes you wonder, from those ancient vexilloids to the flags we fly today, how did these powerful symbols keep shaping who we are, organizing our communities, and rallying us all to a common cause?
Thanks so much for joining us on this trip into the past. If you thought this was as fascinating as we did, do us a favor and hit like, subscribe, and share it with someone. It really helps us out. We'll be bringing you more deep dives from the First Civilizations archives very soon.